Okay, we're going to be talking about Chapter 19, which is Avian Anatomy and Physiology, and we'll finish up with a few things to watch out for when you see your uh, bird at the veterinarian. Learning objectives today will include describing the anatomical structures of avian skin, beak, and claws, so the integument. We'll also describe the structure and functions of feathers, very much like hair with a mammal. We'll list the types of hairs and the location of each type, the unique features of the avian skeleton and musculature. We'll also describe the shape and general characteristics of avian eyes and explain how those characteristics affect visual acuity. We'll describe the unique anatomical features that affect the sense of hearing in nocturnal owls, and we'll talk about the unique anatomical features that affect the sense of taste in birds. We'll also list the components of the avian digestive system and describe the functions of each of those components. We'll list the unique features of the avian circulatory and respiratory systems, and that's pretty cool. We'll also just describe the composition of avian urine. We'll talk about the unique features of the male and female reproductive systems and describe 4 classifications of newly hatched chicks. Starting with the skin, the epidermis is a thin layer of flattened epithelial cells that produce keratin. As you probably have noted, when you are eating chicken or if you've handled birds at all, they have very thin skin. The keratin is that fibrous protein that's necessary for production of scales, feathers, and the outer sheath of beaks and claws. So a very thin layer of flattened epithelial cells. They do have a dermis, which is a thick layer of fibrous connective tissue. This is what stores fat for nutrition and insulation. And there are smooth muscles in the dermis that innervate those feather follicles, which aid in heat regulation. If you've ever seen a bird fluffed up in the wintertime, they look really fat. They're not, they're just fluffed up, and that's to trap air close to their body so that they can keep the heat in their body. Some birds have a gland called the uropygial or preen gland, and this is on the dorsal surface at the upper base of the tail. And this is what it looks like. It's typically hidden by feathers. So this is the top of the tail, and here is the preen gland. It stimulates when they're preening, which means they are rubbing their beak or grasping their feathers from one end and going to the other. It stimulates the secretion of an oily and fatty substance, and the bird will use its beak to spread that oil throughout its feathers to both clean and waterproof them. The beak is a derivative of skin. It's made up of a horny keratin layer. Both the upper and lower mandible are covered with that horny keratin layer. It grows continuously, and it will vary in hardness and flexibility. It depends on the function. So if you think of a duck or a duck bill versus a parrot beak, they're very different in their hardness and flexibility. This growing continuously is pretty important because if we don't provide birds with something to wear their beak down on, it can overgrow and cause problems. There's the claws. This is the bone, and here is the claw that covers the bone. The horny sheath is derived from specialized scales at the end of each toe, and it does, again, grow continuously. There are variable types of claws depending on whether they're perching birds or standing birds or how they procure their food. So this bone actually goes most of the length of this claw. That's why it's very difficult to actually trim these claws without getting them to bleed. Feathers are outgrowths of skin. They are made of protein and their functions are flight. They are to protect the thin skin from trauma, rain, and excessive radiation from sunlight. They assist in thermoregulation and camouflage, and in some birds, they're used in communication behaviors, for example, courtship, defense, and recognition. The feather structure, it's important to understand the feather structure. The inferior umbilicus is the opening at the base of the feather, so it's at the very bottom of the feather shaft. The superior umbilicus is the opening on the feather shaft where the webbed part of the feather begins. This may give rise to an afterfeather, which is an accessory feather that's thought to provide additional insulation. So Right where the feather begins, if we see a little tiny accessory feather, that will help to provide insulation. The calamus is what we call the quill. It's round, it's hollow, and it's semi-transparent and extends from the inferior to the superior umbilicus. So the umbilicus is from where it attaches to the skin, the follicle, to where the feather part actually starts. Rake eyes, or rachis, is the main feather shaft. The vane is the flattened part of the feather, and on the vane there are numerous slender, closely spaced barbs that give rise to barbules containing hooklets. And these hooklets will interlock with each other, kind of like Velcro. So they interlock each barb with an adjacent one. So this hooklet will hook onto this hooklet. So this barb um, is this barb is connected through the hooklets and barbules together. Now, if you run your fingers along a feather from the superior umbilicus to the end, the feather looks like it's intact. If you run it the opposite direction, you can see the barbules separating and the barbs separating. You can almost see those hooklets. They kind of just spread in all directions. It's not supposed to be that way. Whenever you watch a bird preening, they will do it from the inferior to superior umbilicus and all the way to the tip of the feather. So the different types of feathers. Here's the vane, the flat part of the feather. Okay. Here's the rachis, that is this umbilicus, and then the rachis and the vane on either side of the rachis. And this rachis has barbs that then have barbules that connect to hooklets in between. So these are the contour feathers. They're the feathers you typically think of when you're thinking of feathers. They are flight feathers of the wings and the tail. We call those remiges and rectrices, and they're moved by muscles that are attached to the walls of the follicles. They help to control flight. There are also contour feathers that look like this but smaller. They're called auriculars because they're around the external ear openings, and they improve the bird's hearing ability. So they funnel sound into the ears. This is a semi-plume feather. These have main rake eyes, just like the contour feather, and they have barbs coming off the main rachis. There's no barbule or hooklet, so these are not contained within a certain structure. They're kind of going every which way. So these are semi-plume feathers. They are found underneath those contour feathers. They provide insulation and also some flexibility for movement of the contour feathers. They also help with buoyancy in water birds. Down feathers are these soft, fluffy feathers. They don't really have a true shaft. The rachis is not defined. There are no barbules. There are no hooklets. They're located next to the skin under the contour feathers, and their basic function is insulation. Then we have phyloplume. So we had contour, semi-plume, down feathers, and phyloplume feathers. This is a bare shaft with barbs just on the tip, and these located on the nape and upper back near the contour feathers. These may have nerve endings in the follicle that can play a role in controlling feather movement. So they're kind of there to sense where the feathers are and perhaps where the feathers need to go in order to change direction. Bristles, this is a different kind of feather. It's a modified contour feather, so it has a stiff rachis with few barbs at the base, at the inferior umbilicus. And this may play a role in sense of touch, and they usually are found around the eyes, nostrils, mouth, and toes. Then we also have powder down feathers. These grow continuously at the base of the feathers, and they disintegrate at their tip. And they create a waxy powder that spreads throughout the rest of the plumage. Birds without a uropygial gland will have more abundant powder down feathers, so they'll actually be messier birds that will leave more powder dust around their cage. Now, it's important to realize the structure of feathers because this is normal. The pterali are where the tracks of feathers are located. So feathers are located just along these tracks. They're not randomly placed like we might think of hair on a dog or hair on a person. They are actually in lines along the skin. The apteria are bare areas of skin that lie between the pterolae. Feathers in the pterolae overlap with one another, so you can't see these apteria unless we're talking about a newly hatched chick that is just starting to grow feathers. So you can see this little baby, probably robin, who is having feather growth along lines and with the apteria. So that we've got the pterolae of lines of feathers with the apteria in between. All right, feather damage. Here's the disease of the feathers. Feather mites and other external parasites can chew and consume parts of the feather veins. Also, daily wear and tear. You can see the lighter tips of the flight and tail feathers can be worn off as well, especially if they're in a cage that is too small or too confining for them. But this is a sign of feather mites. We have chewing off of the tips of the feathers. The other thing that we can see pretty frequently, especially in animals that are under stress or have poor nutrition, is a fault bar or stress bar. Think of rings on a tree. When we look at the rings of a tree after it's been cut down, we can actually determine how the growth of that tree was given a particular year. So there may be, a year where it grew a lot, so that's going to be a bigger ring, or a year where it couldn't grow very much because of a drought, and that's going to be a smaller ring. So we can see the same kind of growth on nails and in hair and in feathers because of the length of time that it takes to grow. We can see problems as it was growing, that we had problems where things didn't come together quite right to make a good feather. So in this case, we're talking about a fault bar. What happens is we have this weakened area on the feather vein and where barbs lack barbules, so you'll see a line across it. This results from stress that interrupts blood flow during feather growth. A common stressor is a poor diet. Most people don't know that a lot of the birds that they can get as pets need a different diet than an all-seed diet. They need much more nutrition than is provided by seeds. Molting is a process of feather replacement, and it occurs once to several times a year. It depends on species. So if people say, oh my gosh, my bird is losing all its feathers, it could be a normal molting period. Most species, feather replacement is symmetrical, so they will have one or two pairs of flight feathers that will fall out on either side, and then they will grow out at the same time. Many species of waterfowl molt all their flight feathers at once after the breeding season. So I want you to think about this and remember this when you see Canada geese wandering around with their offspring. They cannot move out of your way. They have to walk across the street because they cannot fly. They have molted all their flight feathers, and now they are stuck walking around with their offspring, which is probably helpful for their offspring, and they cannot fly to get out of your way. You will not see them starting to take flight until the fall when their flight feathers have grown back. Feathers develop from a papillae in feather tracts in the dermis, so it's very much like hair growing. They contain cells with genetic information that dictates the type, the size, and the color of the feathers. Hormones will stimulate molting and will activate those cells in the papillae, which will start to grow the feather. And you can see this baby feather in here. Here's the papillae. Here's the follicle around the papillae. This baby feather is within this periderm. If we go back to the picture of this little bird, you can see the periderm here. It is covering the feathers that are growing within it. Newly developing feather will push that old feather out, and that feather emerges covered by that periderm, and they preen themselves to remove that periderm, to take it off. Blood vessels from the dermis reach into the new feather, and when the feather is fully grown, the blood will dry up. So that's what we call a blood feather. It's a feather that is not completely formed yet. And if we see a lot of blood feathers in an animal, it tells us that we've had some extra molting, which could have been due to poor nutrition as well. All right, the skeletal system. This is the skeleton of a bird. It looks different from a mammal because it is. We have some differences in the skeleton that I'd like to point out. Obviously, we have two mandibles. We have an upper and a lower mandible. We have an elongated skull here. Um, we have a different number of cervical vertebrae. Can be, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is what we have in ours. 8, 9, 10, 11 cervical vertebrae in this bird. Swan can have as many as 21. They typically have 21 vertebrae. They do have thoracic vertebrae, much like ours, and then they have their lumbar region and their sacrum and their pelvis are all fused together as the synsacrum. Synsacrum. They have weirdly shaped ribs. They look kind of like a Y. They attach on 2 points to the vertebrae. These 2 points are called the uncinate process. I'm sorry, it has a point of attachment to the vertebrae and a process that sticks up as well for muscle attachment along the back. And these are the uncinate process. So synsacrum, uncinate process, those are both very different. The scapula runs along the vertebrae. We have a long humerus, our ulna and radius. The radius is smaller than the ulna in the bird. We have our carpal area here, which is the wrist area. And off this carpal area, we have this lovely little bone that's like the thumb. It's called the allula. It's the first digit, so that would be like the thumb, called the allula. And then we have a second digit. After our major metacarpals, we have our second digit and our third digit down here. We also have a coracoid. This coracoid is the clavicles coming together. Below that, we have the sternum. This is what we feel when we are feeling the keel of the bird. There are pectoral muscles on either side of this, but this is the sternum, the coracoid, and the ribs, the femur, and then the tibiotarsus, which is another fused bone. We don't have a separate fibula. A tarsometatarsus, so it's the hock part. And then we have different configurations of claws of digits. These are called halices, and they are digits that come off the tarsometatarsus. So these skeletal modifications allow for flight and walking. There's a reduction in number of bones, so most of these bones are fused together. Fusion of some of those bones form plates like the synsacrum, and there's a reduction in bone density. There's a loss of internal bone matrix, and the bone becomes hollow and filled with air spaces. That makes the bird lighter. Within the skull bones are thinner than in other animals, so we need a nice light head. The jaws extend into a keratinized bill. There are large eye sockets, and a lot of them are bordered by a sclerotic ring. This is an eye socket that protects the around the sclera of the eye, and it's a protective bony plate. So they're very similar words here. We have external nares on top of the premaxilla or the upper mandible. There's the hinge here. It's the craniofacial hinge. We have the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the zygomatic process down here. We have the jugal arch right here, the quadrate bone down here that articulates with the neck. We have a prefrontal bone here, premaxilla or upper mandible, and the lower mandible. On the vertebral column, again, the cervical vertebrae, the atlas only contains a single condyle for attachment of the skull. This allows for a greater range of head movements. We have 2 condyles on our skull, so we can nod our head and we can turn it from side to side, but we can't rotate it all the way around. There's a greater number of cervical vertebrae in mammals than in mammals, but it's variable between species. Like I said, the swan has 21 vertebrae. That example of the parrot that we saw in the skeleton of the parrot was 11 vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae are rigid and provide a strong support for the rib cage. The first few ribs are relatively short and incomplete. The remaining ribs attach to the underside of the sternum and have a projection called the uncinate process that overlaps the adjoining rear rib to strengthen the rib cage. The lumbar and sacral vertebrae are fused together and called the synsacrum. It's a strong bony plate created from that fusion of the several distal lumbar vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae, and the first few coccygeal vertebrae. And the synsacrum then fuses with the pelvis and supports the legs. The coccygeal vertebrae, the first few are mobile, so the tail can move. And then there is a pygostyle, remember the uropygial gland, is a bony structure that's created from the fusion of some of those coccygeal vertebrae. So that pygostyle is in the back of the, in the tail area. The sternum is large and concave. We need to have big flight muscles there. That's where the origin of the flight muscles are, those pectorals. In some species, those muscles attach to a large bony ridge or keel. In flightless birds, the sternum will lack a keel. So in flightless birds, they'll have a flat sternum, but in this bird is a bird of flight, so it has a keel. Here is the coracoid, which fuses with the clavicle and the scapula. The pectoral girdle, this is not a picture of the pectoral girdle, I'm sorry, this is a picture of the pectoral girdle, not pelvic girdle, but pectoral girdle. We have paired coracoids, scapula in the back, and the clavicles arching around to the front. The glenoid cavity is also called the triosteal canal, is formed by the joining of the scapula and the coracoid, glenoid cavity. It's the site of wing joint attachment. The clavicles are the wishbones, and they're positioned outward and forward from the body. The wings, there is a joint at the shoulder that allows rotation in several planes. The humerus, the wing muscles of the humerus attach at the pectoral crest of the humerus. So the pectoral crest attaches to the pectoral muscles. Humerus length will vary. It's shorter in birds with a flapping flight. So birds that flap their feathers a lot, like pigeons, versus birds, they're longer in birds that glide and soar. So a hawk or falcon will glide and soar, and so they will have a longer humerus. Wings. The joint at the elbow only allows movement parallel to the wing. So it's very much like our elbow joint. We don't get a lot of movement except flexing up and down. It's a hinge joint. The ulna has a larger diameter than a radius, so it's very different from the mammal. There is something called a patagium or propatagium, which is the web of skin that lies between the shoulder and that first joint in the wing. So it'll be the patagium from here to here is that web of skin, and that there's a ligament that runs at its cranial edge that provides elasticity to the wing and assists in aerodynamics. So I've got it circled here, the patagium. That alula bone, it's the thumb. It originates from the wrist and carries the alula feathers, which are the steering feathers. So it's really important. There are also metacarpal bones, which are like your hand bones, that join with the second and third fingers near the distal end of the wing, and those help support the primary flight feathers. The pelvic girdle. There are 3 paired bones, the pelvic girdle, that join where the leg attaches to the body. The ilium, which is broad and is fused to the synsacrum, and then the ischium and pubis. Here's the ischium, here's the pubis. Those are thin, long, and fused to the ilium anteriorly. The femur is the drumstick. It is short, it is wide, and is directed forward at the knee. It allows for the lower parts of the bird's leg to be under its center of gravity. The greater and lesser trochanters on the femurs are the site of attachment to the leg muscles, the thigh muscles, okay? The tibiotarsus and the fibula end at the hock joint, and the hock joint is a single elongated bone called the tarsometatarsus. On the feet, they have a metatarsal pad, which is the bottom of the foot, and it's surrounded by 2, 3, or 4 toes, and you need to know what these look like and how to relate them to different birds. So This is obviously a duck foot. It's mallard. We have a small digit protruding backwards and then 3 digits protruding in the front. The hawk has one backwards, one sort of towards the back and medially, and then 3 towards the front, and that is for grasping prey. On the woodpecker, we have 2 in the back and 2 in the front, and it's for climbing trees, versus a grouse has 3 projecting pretty thick toes, so they don't perch on branches at all. So if you look at the form of the foot, you can determine the function of that foot. So anisodactyl, aniso means one different. One toe faces the rear and the other 3 face forward. That's anisodactyl. Zygodactyl or zygodactyl are second and third toes face forward, and the first and fourth are directed backwards. The digits are numbered, so digit 1 will be the rear toe, and it usually just has 1 joint. Digit 2 is the medial toe, and that has 2 joints. Digit 3 has 3 joints, and digit 4, which is lateral, tends to have 4 joints. Muscles. They do have obviously skeletal muscles, and they can have white or red muscle fibers or a combination of both. Do you like white meat at Thanksgiving, or do you like dark meat? If you're vegetarian, I'm sorry, but this is how you need to think about it. White fibers are thick in diameter. They have a low blood supply and very little myoglobin. They use stores of glycogen to sustain muscle contraction. These are found in flight muscles of short distance flyers. So they're sprinters. They're not long distance runners. Okay, so white fibers, the white meat is a low blood supply. The red meat, red fibers are thin, have a rich supply of blood, fat, myoglobin, and mitochondria, and these are found in the flight muscles of long distance flyers. So these are your long distance runners, have red fibers. And you can actually change an animal from more white meat to more dark meat depending on how much and how they use those muscles. Wing muscles. I'm not going to have you memorize these except for a few of them. They will raise or depress the leading edge of the wing. They'll pull the wing forward or backward, and they'll extend or flex the wing to control movements of the lula bone. This is the patagial longus. So it runs along this patagium where that ligament is. And so I do think that is something that's important to remember. The patagial longus, you can see it has several different points of attachment. So there are several different ways this muscle can be used to move that wing. There's the deltoids up here. The triceps are down here. We have, trying to find, here's the triceps down here. It's hard to find. It's hard to look at these and think mammalian, but there are a couple of things that you can see that do look like the mammalian. The latissimus dorsi comes to the back, and the pectorals will go to the front. Here's a pectoralis major. It's a really big muscle, and it comes up and it goes underneath that patagial longus muscle. Here is the biceps. You can see it medially. Here are the triceps underneath the bone. The pectoralis, which is a large superficial muscle, flight muscle, its origin is the sternum, and its insertion is the underside of the humerus. It depresses the wing, so you get your downstroke by flexing your pectorals. The supracoracoideus, which is a small muscle and it is deeper, its origin is on the sternum, but its insertion is on the top of the humerus. So when it contracts, it brings the wing up. That's the upstroke. So pectoralis is the downstroke, supracoracoideus is the upstroke. The leg muscles, these are primarily located over the femur. There are a small number that are located over the tibiotarsus and the tarsometatarsal. So the drumstick down here, and we have our thigh muscles up here. Muscles of the head and neck, the extent of the jaw muscles vary depending on the bird's feeding habits. The neck muscles allow movement in different directions. There is a muscle called the hatching muscle that is used to help the chick break the shell open. It does atrophy after hatching. We don't see it again after the bird has hatched. They don't use it again. All right, sense organs. Their senses are a little bit different from ours. Now, you'll note that their cerebral hemisphere does not have a lot of gyri on it. Now, the more gyri it does have, the smarter the bird is. So the smoother it is, the less they are able to think logically. So we do have a very large optic lobe in some birds because they rely on vision quite a bit to catch their prey. We have olfactory bulb, the optic nerve, and the cerebellum, which is also hearing control center. Location of the control centers of the brain are similar to mammals. The control centers for vision and hearing are relatively large, and the control centers for taste, touch, and smell are relatively small. They don't use those as much. Vision is usually highly developed. The optic lobes make up a majority of the midbrain. The eye shape is determined by the orbits, and those orbits size are determined by what type of bird it is. Diurnal birds, birds that are awake mostly during the day, have round or flat eyes. Nocturnal species have tubular eyes, and the position of the eyes on the head also vary as well. So anatomy of the eye, they have a fibrous tunic that is around the sclera and the cornea. And then remember, they also have this bone. It's a sclera that contains a ring of bone called the sclerotic ring. The uveal tunic has the choroid, iris, and ciliary muscles. And there is a nictating membrane that may actually have a clear center. So in dogs and cats will have a nictating membrane or a third eyelid that will come up, but it is not transparent. A lot of times the nictating membrane in birds can have a clear center so they can close and protect that eye, but still be able to see through it. There's a neural tunic, which is where the retina is, and they have pectin, a vascular structure that is attached to the retina. It is right here in the back of the eye. And it should be P-E-C-T-E-N, not T-I-N. Photoreception. They do have rods and cones similar to mammals. Nocturnal birds have more rods than cones. It's the same for nocturnal mammals. Rods contain rhodopsin, which is a night vision pigment. The retina is lightly vascularized and contains numerous photoreceptor cells. Some species have a second temporal fovea rather than a single central fovea. This allows them better depth perception. So if you're talking about a hawk that is a mile up, not quite a mile up, but it's 1,000 feet up in the sky, and they're looking down, they can actually see a mouse and make a really good judgment about where exactly that mouse is so that when they dive in for it, they'll be able to catch it. Birds can also see a much wider spectrum of wavelengths than we can, so they're able to discern color variations in species and different types of birds much better than we can. So a bluebird looks like a bluebird looks like a bluebird to us, but to other bluebirds, there are significant differences within their color range. Hearing and equilibrium, the ears are located behind and slightly below the eyes. There is a columella, which is a single bone in the middle ear, much like in a reptile. That single bone allows for a little less differentiation of sounds. The external ear is often bordered with those auricular feathers that help to funnel sound in. So columella instead of the incus, malleus, and stapes. Hearing in nocturnal owls, they have a fleshy flap of skin. It's called the operculum at each external opening that helps to funnel sound in the ears. And their ear openings are asymmetrical because that will help them with the vertical location of sound. So they're using sound to help them hear in the dark, as well as using eyes that have a little bit more rhodopsin, have more rods than cones. They have large eardrums. They have columella, cochlea, and well-developed acoustic center in the hindbrain, and a very large number of auditory neurons. Taste and touch. Taste buds, few in number, and they're scattered on the sides of the tongue and the soft palate. They do have nerve endings for touch. They have something called Grandery's corpuscle in the tongue and the palate of species that dig for food, so it helps them to determine this is food, this is not food. The Herbst corpuscle is sensitive to feather movement. which is interesting. It helps them to determine if they need to adjust their feathers for thermoregulation, for camouflage, or even for flight. Smell is highly variable. In some species, it's very well developed and it's needed for locating food. In other species, it's less developed, but it's adequate. The endocrine system, they have 7 major endocrine glands and it functions similar to mammals. So here's our pituitary gland, here's our thyroid and parathyroid gland, thymus, usually widely scattered within the ventral neck, adrenal gland. We have gonads, either testes or ovaries. Those are all located inside the bird, the kidney, the pancreas, and then they also have a bursa of Fabricius. Now, if you remember back to one of our first lectures, remember the bursa of Fabricius are where B cells are formed. The digestive system starts with the beaks, which vary with the diet and foraging habits. Seed eaters will have a thick, crushing beak. Woodpeckers will have a heavy, blunt, chiseling beak. Raptors will have a sharp-edged, tearing, hooked beak. And shorebirds will have a long, delicate, probing beak. The mouth consists of the hard upper palate, the soft lower palate, the distinctive tongue, distinctive to that species, the salivary glands, and the taste buds. Soft palate may be enlarged into a pouch that is used to temporarily store food. Think about penguins, think about pelicans. The tongue has few muscles in most species. The crop is an expansion of esophagus over the furcula in some species, and it's a storage pouch for food. So here is the esophagus. These are 2 different species. Esophagus, a small crop. Here the crop is much larger. Here's the proventriculus, which is the glandular stomach. And then we have the gizzard, which is the mechanical crushing stomach. Then we have the duodenum with the pancreas in it. We have the jejunum, which is much longer. We have the ileum. We don't really have a cecum in these guys, if you haven't noticed. And then we go into the large intestine. Empties into the cloaca and then out through the vent of the animal. The stomach, 2 compartments beyond the crop. We have the glandular stomach, which is the proventriculus, and the muscular stomach, which is the gizzard. The proventriculus is called the anterior glandular stomach, and it's the site where chemical digestion begins. The gizzard or muscular stomach has striated muscles that grind food, so kind of like skeletal muscles, not exactly smooth muscles. Many birds ingest small pieces of grit that land in the gizzard, and they help to aid in grinding the food. The liver is bilobed, with the right lobe being larger than the left. The pancreas is relatively large, and it rests in the loop of the duodenum. The endocrine portion of the pancreas occupies more tissue mass than in mammals, so there's a lot of need for glucose regulation. The duodenum is the main digestive organ. It varies in length and thickness, and it just depends on the diet. The ceca, so they do have a cecum, but they're very small. They're paired sacs at the junction of the large and small intestines in some species. So that's where there are some species that carry worms, cecal worms, and that's where we'll find them, in the ceca. The ceca play a role in water reabsorption and bacterial fermentation of cellulose. So if it's a plant-eating bird, they are more likely to have ceca. The contents are excreted independent of fecal material, so it's not part of the poop portion of the mute. The cloaca is the end of the digestive tract. Obviously, it's also the end of the urinary tract and the end of the respiratory, or the not respiratory, but the the reproductive tract. So the coprodeum is the anterior section. It receives excrement from the intestine. The urodeum receives discharge from the kidneys and the genital ducts, and the proctodeum is the posterior section which stores the excrement. The vent is what we call the muscular anus. Feeding habits. Diet is determined by physical characteristics, so the type of bill, the feet, the plumage, and the development of senses. Daily activity cycle, whether they're diurnal versus nocturnal. Flight style and endurance. Their habitat, the time of year, the geographical location, their sex, and their age. The heart is 4-chambered. In the cranial portion, it's in the cranial portion of the thoraco-abdominal space. So within their body, there is one space called the coelom, and it has the thorax and the abdomen with no diaphragm in between. It is enclosed, the heart is enclosed by a thin, fibrous, fluid-filled pericardial sac, much like the mammalian heart. And this sac is adherent to several internal surfaces, so it's held in place. Here's the heart. Here's the left lobe of the liver. There is no diaphragm in between. Blood vessels. So important blood vessels to note are the blood vessels that we take blood from. There are pectoral and brachial arteries. So the pectoral artery will come over the chest. The brachial artery is one of those that or actually the brachial vein that goes along with the brachial artery is the one that we will target along with the jugular, which comes up the side of the bird. Usually we get it on the left side. So the brachial, the jugular, and sometimes the femoral vein is where we will get blood. They do have something called the renal portal system, which shunts blood through the kidneys, and it can take blood when you give injections back here in the back portion, just like reptiles. They can get it into their renal portal system, which can cause some issues. They do have a countercurrent heat exchange system. Have you ever wondered how birds with their naked little legs can sit out on a cold day? Well, it's this countercurrent heat exchange system. In the lower extremities of some species, there are a network of arteries and veins which are placed close together. Heat from the arterial blood is transferred to the cooler venous blood, so it keeps it at a constant temperature, not too cold, not too hot. All right, the blood. The erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are oval and nucleated. Here they are here. Okay, this is a red blood cell erythrocyte. The percentage of red blood cells in the healthy bird is between 35 to 55%. So that's the PCV that we should see. Heterophils are like neutrophils. They have a bilobed nucleus. They have rod-shaped red-orange granules within that cytoplasm. So this is what a heterophil looks like. This is an eosinophil. This is a heterophil. They look a little darker than the eosinophil. All right, this is really interesting, and we're going to go through this in class as well, especially if you say, I don't understand the respiratory system. They have 9 air sacs and a pair of lungs. And when they breathe, in order to get air through that entire respiratory system, it takes 2 breaths. On the first inspiration, that first inspired air is brought in and brought all the way to the back to the abdominal air sacs, of which there are 2. The posterior thoracic and abdominal air sacs get filled. Now they'll breathe out, and as they breathe out, they will breathe air into their lungs. When they breathe in again, this air will move, this first air will move back to the back, and it will push air into the lungs and into the cranial air sacs, which would be 2 cervical air sacs, 1 interclavicular air sac, and 2 anterior thoracic air sacs. And then the second expiration will push that breath of air out. Okay, so they're constantly doing this. So if you follow 1 breath of air, you will follow it through 2 cycles of inspiration and expiration. The oral cavity. We have the glottis, which is the opening at the back of the tongue, the bottom of the mouth. We have the choana, which is a slit that is from the nares at the top of the bill. The external nares are at the top of the bill. The internal nares are at the top of the mouth. They open from those nasal chambers into the roof of the mouth. The larynx is beyond the glottis, and it does not function in the production of sound as in mammals. We have a trachea, which can be long and coiled in some species, so it'll coil around. The syrinx is where we get our sound production. It's an enlargement of the trachea just above the lungs. So instead of a larynx right at the top of the trachea, we have the syrinx at the bottom of the trachea. There are muscles, air sacs, and vibrating membranes that provide the vocalization. And the complexity of this vocalization depends on the number of muscles present in the syrinx. So the more muscles, the more complex sounds you can get. The bronchi, there are mesobronchi, which are within the lungs. There are no cartilaginous rings in these mesobronchi. They divide into secondary bronchi, which are called ventrobronchi, which divide further into parabronchi, which are connected to air capillaries in their site of the gas exchange. So there are no clumps of grapes in these lungs. These are literally branches that come out. So they really do look more like this, more like a radiator than it looks like a bunch of grapes. Air sacs are thin-walled, lightly vascularized membranes. The parabronchi, okay, are lightly vascularized membranes. They're, I'm sorry, not air sacs. These parabronchi are connected to air capillaries. That's where we have the gas exchange. The air sacs themselves, remember I said first we fill those caudal air sacs, push it into the lungs, push it out of the lungs into the cranial air sacs, and then out of the body. These air sacs are thin-walled, lightly vascularized membranes. They are paired. So we have 2 craniothoracic, 2 caudal thoracic, 2 cervical, and 2 abdominal air sacs. And then we have 1 unpaired that is the interclavicular air sac. These are just reservoirs for air. They provide warmth and moisture to facilitate diffusion of the air through the capillaries when they get into the lungs. They also aid in thermoregulation and help to provide buoyancy. So these air sacs are, again, things that make this bird a little bit lighter than normal. The lungs are small and inelastic. They really do kind of look like that radiator when you look at them microscopically. They are attached to the thoracic vertebrae and the ribs, and those air capillaries are at right angles to the blood capillaries. Carbon dioxide is continually removed from the blood and oxygen is continually added. So we've got oxygen continually moving through the body. Airflow, so we get inspiration, expansion of the thoraco-abdominal space. Those ribs need to move in order to get inspiration. That creates that pressure gradient that brings air, sucks air into the posterior air sacs. Expiration then pushes air into the lungs. And the second inspiration moves air out of the lungs into the anterior air sacs, and the second expiration moves air out through the trachea. So inspire, expire, and our air sacs are continuously full. The respiratory rate varies with species, activity level, age, sex, time of day, and outdoor temperature. Smaller birds usually breathe faster than larger birds. Birds in flight have a higher respiratory rate than non-flying birds. Thermoregulation. Air in the lungs picks up heat from the body tissues and the arteries and blood and removes it from the body during the breathing process. Increased airflow, like panting, over the mouth, pharynx, bronchi, and air sacs increases cooling. We can achieve this through panting or through gular fluttering. This is rapid vibrations of the upper throat patch. Birds bathe or reduce activity level during the warmest parts of the day. Some species defecate on their legs for evaporative cooling. It's pretty classy. They can adjust the positions of their body feathers and posture to promote both heat loss and heat retention. And then again, we have the countercurrent heat exchange system that limits heat loss through their bare legs. The urogenital system. It differs, obviously, male to female, but also if they're breeding or not breeding. If we have a non-breeding, it's not that time of year where they're breeding, that testis is going to be very small. You're going to have, everything's going to be a little bit smaller for this bird. Externally, a lot of these birds look exactly the same. Unless their plumage is different, you can't tell a male or a female apart. Now, if this animal is breeding, we'll have a larger testes. With birds, for the most part, only the left ovary is functional. The right ovary is down here. It's vestigial. So only the left ovary produces eggs through the oviduct and into the cloaca. The kidneys are located dorsally in a slight depression formed at the level of the synsacrum, and it's elongated with 3 divisions. There is no renal pelvis. The 3 divisions subdivide into lobules containing the nephrons. So here's that renal tubule, here's the central vein, here's the glomerulus, there's a capillary net around it. The ureters are surrounded by smooth muscle that help to squeeze urates from the kidney or inhibit their flow into the cloaca. Urine passes through ureters to the uridium of the cloaca. It's either moved upward to the colon and ceca for further reabsorption of water, or it's propelled outward through the vent. Urine composition. This is a mute. Okay, this is the primary nitrogenous waste component is uric acid. The waste is eliminated as a paste with a small quantity of fecal material. Excreted product, this is a mute. This whole bird dropping is a mute. So we have the water portion of it, watery portion, then we have this pasty portion, the uric acid, and then we have this white portion, and we have this fecal portion. Reproduction is periodic. Increasing daylight stimulates the release of hormones that directly affect the reproductive process. Reproductive organs are larger on the left side of the body, and in females, the right ovary is rudimentary and not even functional. During non-breeding season, gonads are relatively small. Copulation is achieved in one of two ways. There is sometimes the grooved erectile penis attached to the wall of the cloaca that helps to transfer the sperm into the female's vagina. There can also be sperm transfer when a male and female bring their cloaca into close proximity. So they don't even have to insert, we just get close proximity. Within the oviduct, there are different portions, and it is important for you to understand what happens in each part of this oviduct. In the infundibulum, it's the same as the mammal. It grabs the ovum as it comes out of the ovary. Within the magnum secretes layers of albumin around the egg. The isthmus deposits a keratin shell membrane. So think about the egg, think about a hard-boiled egg. That layer of albumin around the egg is the white. The keratin shell, the keratin membrane, is a thin membrane. If you're peeling an egg, you know there's that thin membrane that you get between the shell and the actual egg white. The uterus deposits a watery albumin, a hard external shell, and pigmentation. The uterus is large and muscular. It's also called the shell gland because guess what? That's where the hard external shell is put on. The vagina secretes mucus to assist in egg laying. It can actually store sperm for several hours to several days. So here it is again. We have the ovary developing eggs. We have a mature ovum. Fertilization will occur up towards the infundibulum. Once the magnum receives the egg, we get the first layer of albumin or egg white here. In the isthmus, we get the egg and the shell membranes and some more albumin here. In the shell gland or the uterus, where it gets really strong, we get albumin, shell, and pigment added here. And then we get into the vagina here. A clutch is the number of eggs that a female lays and incubates, and it varies among species. Many species lay one egg per day. Chickens will often lay one egg every 24 to 36 hours, depending on the species of chicken or the breed of chicken. Some species lay eggs every other day, and some larger species may lay at 4 to 5 day intervals. The total number of eggs that a female can lay varies with the species. There are determinate layers which lay a specific number of follicles that develop. So if you look at a robin's nest, they are determinate layers. There's 3 or 4 eggs only within that nest. That's all they can handle. Indeterminate layers can produce more eggs than their normal clutch size. They'll continue to lay eggs if their eggs disappear. Chickens, ducks, those are indeterminate layers. Incubation. Average incubation temperature for many species is 35 degrees Celsius. Prolactin is a hormone that promotes broodiness, which is an incubation behavior. Hormones will also stimulate the development of a brood patch. This is an area of skin on the lower abdomen where heat is transferred to the egg. Incubation time varies with species. Hatching involves powerful neck muscles and a specialized egg tooth on the outside of the chick's bill. Here is the egg tooth here, the end of this little hatchling's bill. After hatching, the neck muscles atrophy and the egg tooth disappears. There are different types of chicks, and it differs in the amount of feather cover, the status of their eyes, and the degree of mobility. And you need to know the difference between the different chicks. Altricial are are hatchlings that are hatched with their eyes closed and their skin bare. In this case, we'll think of robins. Semi-altricial are birds that are covered with down and are immobile. Their eyes may be open or closed, so they're stuck in the nest, but they're at least covered with down. A lot of hunting species, raptor species, will have birds like this. Precocial, if you've ever heard of a precocial child, it's a child that is beyond their years in their abilities. A precocial bird is covered with downy feathers. Their eyes are open, they're completely mobile, and they'll leave the nest quickly. Semi-precocial have a downy covering. Their eyes will be open, and they do have some limited movement from the nest. They don't go very far. But a little duckling is precocial. Semi-precocial would be this little hatchling here, which is, I don't remember, it looks like a dove, but most doves actually are born like this. Right, so I'm sure that we didn't cover a lot of stuff here, honestly, and not a lot of diseases. I covered a couple of diseases, so if you have any questions, let's bring them to class. Like I said, most of the diseases that reptiles and avian get are diseases in the care they are getting at home. So if we know how they're supposed to be cared for, then we can educate our clients a little bit better. So bring in your questions. Let's dissect a bird so you can see it, and we'll see you in class.